People want me to say I was a mug. That's the shape they're after. Old bloke, young wife, money gone, and there's a comfort in that story if you're the one listening to it, because it lets you decide you'd have been smarter. I've had it from my brother-in-law. I've had it from a fella in a pub in Ballina who'd never been further than Fiji. I've had it, gently, from a counselor who was very good at her job and still couldn't quite keep it off her face. I'm not going to say it. I'm 68 years old, and I've been talked down to by better people than that. Here's what actually happened. Over 3 years and 4 months, I transferred 837,000 Australian dollars to my wife's family in Chiang Mai province. Every single one of those transfers was for something real. Not one of them was a lie. There was no fake illness, no invented emergency, no boyfriend on the side, no fraud. Nobody stole from me. I signed off on all of it, every baht, with my eyes open. And if you put me back in that kitchen in Mayrim with the same information I had on the day, I'd probably do about 600,000 of it again. That's the part nobody wants. It's much easier if I was robbed. I wasn't robbed. I was asked, and I have never in my life been any good at being asked. Let me tell you about my hands before I tell you about anything else, because you'll understand the rest faster. I left school at 15 in 1972 and went on the tools with my old man's mate in Wollongong, concreter's laborer. My father was a fitter and turner who drank his wage, and my mother cleaned 3 houses in Figtree, and there were 4 of us kids. And I can remember the specific feeling of my mother counting coins on a laminate bench on a Thursday night, and it going quiet in a way that meant it wasn't going to be enough. I was about 9. I'd say that Thursday night has run my entire life, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. I got my ticket. I went out on my own at 24 with a ute and a compressor. By 1989, I had 6 blokes. By 2001, I had 41, and we were doing commercial fit-outs and light industrial from Kiama up to the northern beaches. And by 2018, when I sold it, there were 130 people on the books, and I had never once, not in 43 years, failed to make a payroll. That's the whole man, right there, and I'd like you to hold on to it because everything that follows is that sentence getting me killed. Never once failed to make a payroll. I said it at my daughter's 21st. I said it to my accountant every year like a bloke touching wood. When my youngest needed 40 grand for IVF in 2015, I had it in her account in 90 minutes, and I didn't tell my wife for a fortnight because I didn't want it discussed. I wanted it done. When my foreman's marriage came apart in 2009, I paid his rent for 11 months and told him it was a company thing. When my brother went through his bad patch, I bought his house off him and rented it back to him for 180 a week, and we have never spoken about it, not once, not in 16 years. I wasn't generous. Let me be really clear about that, because generous is a nice word and it's the wrong one. Generous people give and then think about something else. I gave because the alternative, somebody standing in front of me with a problem and me saying I can't help you, produced a physical reaction in my chest that I would have done nearly anything to avoid. I was 9 years old at that bench, and I have spent 59 years making sure nobody in my orbit ever had to count coins. Judy and I split in 2016, 31 years. She'd say it was because I was never home, and she'd be right. And I'd say it was because by the end, we were 2 people running a logistics operation for a family that had grown up and left, and I'd be right too. It was civil. She got the house at Thirul and a clean half, sold the business in 2018 to a Brisbane outfit, and after capital gains and the payout to my partner and the settlement, I came out the other side with a shade over $1.1 million and a superannuation balance I wasn't touching until I was 70. 1.1 million. 60 years old, no debt, 2 grown daughters, no wife, and for the first time since 1972, nobody wanted anything from me. I lasted about 11 months before I started going mad. I'd like to skip that part, and I won't, because it's the bit that explains everything. I bought a boat I used 4 times. I did a coffee course. I turned up at my old yard so often that the new owner, who was decent about it, eventually had a very awkward conversation with me. I rang my daughters more than they wanted. I sat in a 3-bedroom house in Shell Harbour with $110,000 of tools in the shed and a phone that didn't ring, and I understood, with total clarity and no self-pity, that I had been useful my whole life, and that the usefulness had been the only thing holding the frame together. I went to Chiang Mai in February 2019 for a mate's 60th. Shane, who'd been my site supervisor for 11 years and had retired to Hua Hin and hated it and moved north. 3 weeks. I came home and put the house on the market in June. It wasn't a midlife thing and it wasn't a bar thing. Chiang Mai in 2019, if you haven't been, is a city with a wall around a square kilometer of old town and about 200,000 people who are not in a hurry. And it is roughly 22 degrees in the morning, and it smells like frangipani and diesel. And I walked around it for 3 weeks feeling something come back on in me that I'd assumed was permanently off. Also, and I'm going to say this plainly because the polite version is a lie, everybody there wanted something built. Every second shopfront was mid-renovation. Every guest house had a bloke with a hammer doing something structurally alarming. I stood on Ratchadamnoan Road, watching 4 men install a steel lintel in a way that would have got a site shut down in New South Wales, and I felt more alive than I had in 3 years. I moved in October 2019, rented in Santitham first, then a place out toward May Rim with a yard, 35,000 baht a month, which was about 1,500 Australian, and felt like theft. I met Pooky in January 2020, 6 weeks before the world shut. She was 33, and she ran events. Not the wedding planner cliché. Corporate and government work, conferences at the exhibition center, trade expos, agricultural fairs out in the province. The sort of job where you're running 12 subcontractors and a marquee company, and a translator, and the provincial governor's office all at once, and something is always on fire. She was extremely good at it. I know she was extremely good at it because I watched her do it. And I have spent 43 years assessing whether people are good at things, and it is the one judgment I still trust from that period. We met because Shane's neighbor's daughter worked for her, and I got roped into helping shift some staging. That's it. No bar, no app, no introduction agency. I lifted a truss. The thing that got me was not what people assume. It was that she argued with me. Second time we met, she told me I was wrong about a load rating, and she was right. And she did not soften it, and something in my chest sat up. Here's what I knew about her family within the first month, because she told me straight away and without any embarrassment, which I should have registered as information and instead registered as honesty. Mother, Yupin, 61, in May Rim, diabetic, widowed since 2009. An older brother, Narong, 38, married with 3 kids, drove a delivery truck. A younger sister, Sutita, 29, who'd trained as a beautician and hadn't found her feet. A grandmother in her late 80s, in the same house as Yupin. Assorted aunts, uncles, and cousins across Chiang Mai, Lamphun, and Chiang Rai. And by assorted, I mean about 40 people whose faces I would eventually know. And Pooky was the one who earned. Not the eldest. Not the son. Her. She had been sending money home since she was 20. She had paid for her brother's wedding. She had paid for the roof. She had, at 33, been the load-bearing member of a 40-person structure for over a decade. And she said this to me across a table at a place near Nimon with no drama at all. The way you'd mention your commute. I want to tell you what I felt when she said it, because it is the exact moment the whole thing was decided and neither of us noticed. I felt recognition. I thought, this is the same as me. She's me. She's the one who makes payroll. I have thought about that for a long time, and it was true. And being true is what made it dangerous. Because 2 people who both organize their entire identity around provision do not check each other. They confirm each other. Nobody in that relationship was ever going to be the one who said, hang on, this is too much. We got through 2020 and 2021, in a way I'd describe as the best 2 years of my adult life. Which is a strange thing to say about a pandemic, and is nonetheless the case. Chiang Mai emptied out. The tourists went. The digital nomads went. Half the old town shut. And what was left was a provincial Thai city getting on with itself. I couldn't leave, and I didn't want to. I did the burning season in a house with 3 air purifiers going. I got my Thai to the level where I could argue about concrete, which is about as far as it ever got. I did up the May Rim house I was renting, with the landlord's blessing, because I could not physically stop myself. New wiring, because the existing arrangement was an actual fire. Proper drainage. A carport. About 400,000 baht of my own money into a property I didn't own and never would. And I'd do that again too, because it was the happiest 6 months of the whole period, and I got to hold a nail gun. We married on the 14th of February 2022. The date was Pooky's joke and also not a joke, because Valentine's Day is a real thing in Thailand and the district office does brisk business. We did the legal registration at the Amphor in the morning, 30 minutes and a stack of documents including an affirmation of freedom to marry from the Australian Embassy in Bangkok that took me 2 trips and about a month. Then the ceremony out at Mae Rim on the following Saturday. Sin Sod. Let's do this properly because everyone asks. Sin Sod is the sum presented by the groom to the bride's family. It is not a purchase, and anybody who tells you it is has never sat through one. It's a public statement made in front of everybody who matters about the groom's capacity and seriousness, and about the family's standing. In a lot of families, a substantial part of it comes straight back to the couple afterwards, sometimes in the same afternoon. Mine was 500,000 baht, plus 5 baht weight of gold, which was another 200,000 odd. About 32,000 Australian all up. None of it came back. I want to be fair here. Nobody promised me it would, and I never asked. I'd read the forums. I'd been told by 3 separate people that you should expect the bulk of it to return. And when it didn't, I made a decision in about 4 seconds to say nothing about it, ever, to anyone, because raising it would have made me a man haggling at his own wedding. That 4 seconds is the whole story in miniature. I noticed something. I calculated the social cost of mentioning it. I ate it. The wedding itself came to 1.1 million baht. 260 guests, marquee, catering, monks in the morning, a band. I paid for all of it, and I paid for it enthusiastically, and I'd have been offended if anyone had suggested otherwise. The first structured request came 11 days after the wedding. Structured is the right word. It wasn't a handout and a sad face. Narong came to the house with Pooky, and they sat at the table, and he had a folder. Actual printed quotes, 3 of them, from 3 different dealers, for a 1-ton pickup and a set of landscaping equipment. A chipper, a ride-on, a trailer, a couple of blowers. He'd worked out the finance costs of doing it on credit versus cash. He had a page of projected income from the contracts he reckoned he could pick up doing grounds maintenance for 2 of the resorts out that way. It was a business case. It was a better business case than about half of what I saw from suppliers in Australia. 890,000 baht. About 40,000 Australian. I said yes before he'd finished page 2. And listen, that money worked. That's what nobody wants to hear either. Narong ran that business for the entire time I was there, and he ran it well. He had 4 blokes by the 2nd year. He did the grounds at 2 resorts and a school. He is, as far as I know, still doing it. If you gave me a ledger of the $837,000 and asked me to mark the entries that produced a going concern, that's one of them, and I'd sign it again tomorrow. Then Sutita's coffee shop, 1.6 million baht for a lease, and fit out near Wat Phra Singh, which I project managed myself, and which was, if I'm honest, a beautiful little room. That one failed. 18 months. She wasn't lazy, and she wasn't a fool. She was a 29-year-old with no hospitality experience, in a city with 4,000 cafes, and it went the way that goes. Then the house. Yupin's place in Mae Rim was a timber house on a concrete pad, built in stages since about 1987, and it had a roof problem, a termite problem, and a bathroom you would not want your mother using at 61 with bad eyes. I went out there in about June 2022 with a torch and a screwdriver, on my own initiative, nobody asked me, and I came back and told Pooky the place needed replacing, not repairing. I said that. Me. Nobody maneuvered me into it. I did a takeoff on the back of a materials list like I was 29 again, and I told my wife her mother's house was condemned in every meaningful sense. 2.8 million baht. Concrete frame, proper footings, tiled roof, 2 bathrooms, a ramp instead of the step because of Yupin's eyes. Built by a local crew I supervised personally for 9 weeks, and it is the best building I have ever been involved with, and I have been involved with 190 of them. That's about 126,000 Australian. on land I could not own, in a house I would never have any legal interest in, for a woman who could not say my name correctly, and who cried when the ramp went in. Ask me if I regret it. Go on. The monthly started in about the middle of 2022, and I want to be precise about it because it's the one that actually did the damage, and it's the one that felt like nothing. 45,000 baht a month to Yupin, about 2,000 Australian. Set up as a standing transfer so nobody had to ask each time, which was my idea, because I found the asking harder than the paying, and I wanted it gone from the conversation. 40 months, 1.8 million baht, $81,000, out the door, on autopilot, from an instruction I gave once, in about 90 seconds, to spare myself the discomfort of a monthly conversation. Then the grandmother died in November 2022, and the funeral was 280,000 baht, 7 days of it. And I'd do that one again as well. Then the land. 4.2 million baht for 11 rai, out past the family place. Bought in Yupin's name. Presented to me by an uncle over a meal, as an investment for the family's future, and genuinely intended as exactly that. I asked one question, whether it had a proper Shinote title, and it did. And I looked at the deed, and I understood about a third of it, and I said yes. Then T. T was Narong's eldest, 17 when I met him, and he was the one. Every extended family has one, and everybody in it knows who it is. Brilliant kid. Wanted to do engineering. Got into a course in Melbourne for 2023, and the international student fee structure being what it is, that was 41,000 a year in fees plus living costs. And over 3 years it came to 128,000 Australian dollars. 128,000, the single biggest line in the whole thing. I paid it without a second's hesitation, and I would fight a man about it today. That boy is in his final year. He'll be a structural engineer. He'll earn more than his father ever earned by the time he's 28. And he'll do it with a degree from a university I couldn't have got into if I'd sat the exam upside down. Shane said something to me in about March 2023, and I've thought about it a lot. We were at his place. He'd had a couple, and he said, "Mate, do you have a number?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "A number. For the family. A limit. Do you have one, and does she know what it is?" And I said, and this is verbatim because I've replayed it enough. I said, "I've got a business to run, Shane. I don't need a budget to tell me what I can afford." Which was a sentence about a company I'd sold 5 years earlier. He let it go. He's a good bloke, and he'd said his piece, and he didn't say it twice. And I've never held that against him, and if he's watching this, I want him to know that a second go wouldn't have made any difference. I wasn't listening. I was 3 years into the most useful I'd felt since 2018, and he was asking me to stop. Because that's what it was. That's the thing I couldn't have articulated at the time. Every one of those transfers made me somebody. In Australia, I was a retired bloke in Shell Harbour with a boat he didn't use. In May Rim, I was the man who built the house, funded the business, buried the grandmother, and sent the boy to Melbourne. 40 people knew my name and knew what I'd done. I had a chair at the table that was actually mine. I wasn't being drained. I was buying the only thing I'd ever known how to buy, which is the position of the man who makes payroll, and I was getting exactly what I paid for. That is not a con. There's no fraud in that transaction. Both parties got precisely what they came for. One more thing about that period, and it's the bit I've never said out loud before. I stopped seeing the expat crowd. Not deliberately. There was no moment. Shane's Thursday thing at the place on Huaikeo had about 9 or 10 of us in 2021, and by the middle of 2023, I was going maybe once every 6 weeks, and then not at all. And if you'd asked me why, I'd have told you I was busy, which was true, and was not the reason. The reason was that those blokes talked about money, constantly. Every retired man overseas does. It's practically the local sport. What the baht's doing, what the visa agent charges, who's paying too much rent. And I could not sit in that conversation, because at some point somebody would say something like, "I send the missus's mum 10 grand baht a month, mate, it adds up." And everyone would nod. And I would be sitting there having transferred $200,000 that year, and I could not open my mouth. Not because they'd have judged me, because a couple of them would have understood immediately and said something, and I'd have had to hear it. So I withdrew. and I told myself I was choosing family over a pack of blokes complaining about immigration, and I was very pleased with myself about it. And what I had actually done was remove the last people in my life capable of putting a number in front of me and asking what it was. Nobody isolated me. I did that on my own, out of embarrassment, and it cost me about $400,000. Robin has done my books since 1994. She did the company, she did the sale, she did the divorce numbers, and when I moved, she kept doing my Australian returns, because I still had residual income and a super balance, and the tax residency question for an Australian retiree overseas is genuinely complicated, and I wasn't going to touch it myself. She sent me an email on the 11th of June 2023. It wasn't a phone call, and it wasn't dramatic, and it's the least cinematic discovery you'll ever hear about. It was a routine email with the draft return attached, and a paragraph at the bottom, and the paragraph said, more or less, Stewart, I've had a look at the movement on the AMP account and the Westpac cash management account, and I want to flag something. You've drawn down about 61% of the allocated capital in 3 years and 4 months. On the original plan, that fund was structured to run to age 85. At the current rate, it's exhausted in 19 months. Can you give me a call? 61%. I remember exactly where I was, which was on the back step at May Rim with a coffee, and I remember the sound of Narong's chipper going about 400 meters away, and I remember reading that paragraph 5 times and understanding it perfectly well on the first read. I did not feel shocked. That's the honest report, and it does me no credit at all. I felt caught, because I knew. Of course I knew. I'd made 130 people's payroll for 43 years. I could tell you the profit on a job by walking through it, and you do not accidentally not know that you have spent $670,000. What I had done was decline to add it up. Every transfer had been evaluated on its own merits, and everyone had passed on its own merits, and I had simply never once put them in a column, because I had a very accurate sense of what the column would say, and I did not want it said. That is not being deceived. There's a word for it, and the word is denial. And I'm 68, and I can use it about myself. I called Robin that night, her morning. She was kind and she was blunt, which is why I've had her for 30 years. She said, I'm not asking about your marriage. That's not my business. I'm telling you that on these numbers, you're eating your capital at about $17,000 a month, against a plan that assumed 4.5. And if you keep going, you'll be 71 with the age pension and nothing else. That's not a catastrophe. It's a very different retirement from the one you paid for. Then she said the thing that actually got through, and it wasn't about money. She said, you did this in 2003 as well. I'd forgotten. In 2003, I nearly folded the company because I'd carried 3 clients through their own cash flow problems out of loyalty and hadn't chased a receivable in 14 months. Robin had sat me down in an office in Wollongong and put a debtor's ledger in front of me, and I'd had to put 6 people off. 20 years. Same man, same failure, different continent. I went looking after that call, and this is the part that changed the story from a bad decision into something with a different flavor. I wasn't snooping. I want that on the record. I was doing what Robin told me to do, which was build the column. I wanted every transfer in one place, and I wanted the Thai side of it as well as the Australian side. And there was a document I knew existed because I'd seen the cover of it at the funeral. A hardback notebook Yupin kept, which I'd assumed was the family's household accounts, because that's what it was. I asked Wasana to help me with it. Wasana is Pooky's cousin, a couple of years younger, and she'd done a year of school in New Zealand, and had the best English in the family, and had translated for me at about 40 different appointments over 3 years. She was fond of me. She's still fond of me. And she sat with me at the table with that notebook on a Tuesday afternoon in June 2023, and she read it out. And she had no idea what she was doing to me, because to her it was completely ordinary. It was the household accounts. It was also, from the front third onward, a plan. There was a page headed with a date in the Thai calendar corresponding to November 2021, 3 months before the wedding, 10 weeks before I proposed. And on it, in a list, in Yupin's handwriting, was an allocation. Wasana read it out flatly, the way you'd read a shopping list. The house, the pickup and the equipment for Narong, a shop for Sutita, the land. T's education. Priority order, with rough figures beside about half of them, and at the top of the page, as a heading over the whole lot, 3 words that Wasana translated, without any hesitation or any awareness, as money from Stewart, not money from the Farang, my name. She'd written my name. I want to describe what I actually felt, because it was not what I expected, and it's the thing I've spent 2 years unpacking. It wasn't betrayal, it was demotion. For 3 years I had believed I was making a series of individual, generous, freely chosen decisions, each one an expression of who I was. And what that page told me was that I had been a line item. The house wasn't my idea. I thought it was. I genuinely thought it was. I'd gone out there with a torch and a screwdriver on my own initiative. But it was on that page 4 months before I picked up the torch. The land, T, all of it sequenced, before I'd bought a ring. I hadn't been robbed, I'd been forecast. Wasana finished reading and looked up and saw my face and said, "Oh," and then, very quickly, in a voice I'll remember when I've forgotten most things, "It's not bad, Uncle. Everybody does this. My mother has one for my husband, and that's true. She wasn't lying, and she wasn't covering. In a family structure like that one, with 1 earner and 40 dependents and no state pension worth the name, planning around an incoming resource is not villainy, it's arithmetic." She could not understand why I'd gone gray, because in her world I'd just been shown evidence that the family took me seriously enough to plan around. Both of those things are true at once, and I have never been able to make them sit down together. I did not confront Pooky that night. I sat on it for 6 days, which for me is unprecedented. When I did, it was the worst conversation of my life, and there wasn't a raised voice in it. She didn't deny the page. She'd known about it. She said her mother had written it after Pooky told the family we were serious, and that she, Pooky, had asked her mother to stop making a list, and her mother had made one anyway, and that she had never shown it to me, because there was no version of showing it to me that ended well. Then she said the thing I've had to live with. She said, "Stewart, which one would you like back?" And she went through them. "Do you want the house back? Do you want T to stop? Do you want the pickup back off my brother? Tell me which one and I'll arrange it." And I couldn't name one, not a single line. I sat at that table and went down the list in my head, and there was not one entry I was prepared to reverse, because every one of them was a real thing that had helped a real person, and because reversing any of them would have made me a man who took a house off a diabetic woman with bad eyes. She wasn't being cruel. That's what nobody believes. She was making a point with total precision, and the point was, you weren't tricked, you were satisfied, and you're upset because you've discovered you were predictable. She was right about all of it. She was wrong about one thing, and it took me another 4 months to work out what it was, and it's the only genuinely useful thing I learned in 3.5 years. The problem was never any individual line. The problem was that there was no line at all. No total, no ceiling, no annual figure, no mechanism by which a request could be declined for a reason that wasn't a judgment on the person asking. Every request arrived on its own and had to be assessed on its own merits, and every one had merit, and so the answer was always yes, and it was always going to be yes, forever, until the money ran out, at which point I would have become, in 1 week, a man who had failed 40 people. That's not a family taking advantage. That's a system with no governor on it. I built engines my whole life. I should have seen it. The request came on the 9th of October 2023, and it was, by the standards of everything that had come before it, modest. An uncle on Yupin's side, out past Sansai, had had 2 bad seasons on Longan and was carrying about 650,000 baht of debt to a private lender at a rate I never got a straight answer about. Real debt, real man, real problem. About 30,000 Australian, which against 800,000 already gone is a rounding error. They came to the house. Pooky, Yupin, Narong, and the uncle, who was 71 and had put on a shirt with a collar and who could not look at me. And I understood that shame perfectly, because I have been the bloke in that chair in another life. And I said no. I want to tell you how that felt, because it's the actual climax of this story, and it happens at a kitchen table with 6 people and no shouting. It felt like being sick. It felt like a physical event in my chest, The exact one I'd spent 59 years arranging my life to avoid, and it lasted about 4 seconds, and then it kept going for 11 months. I said it in Thai, badly, and then I said it in English so there could be no confusion, and I said the number. I said, I can do 200,000 baht, and that's the last one this year. There is a number, and the number for this year is finished after that, and the room did not explode. That's the thing. Nobody screamed at me. Yupin looked at the table. Narong said something quiet to his mother. The uncle said thank you 3 times for the 200,000 and left 20 minutes later, and I have not seen him since. Not once. Not at anything. And I don't believe that's punishment. I think he was mortified, and I think I would be too. What happened instead was much slower and much worse. I became a different category of person in that house over about 3 months. Not hated, not frozen out, diminished. The invitations kept coming, and the warmth kept coming, and something underneath it had been switched off, and I could not have proved a single instance of it to you if you'd asked me for evidence. 2 examples, and then I'll leave it. In December, there was a thing at the temple that I found out about afterwards, and when I said something, Pooky was genuinely apologetic and said she'd assumed I wouldn't want to come, and she may well have been telling the truth. And in January, Sutita, who I'd put 1.6 million into, and who I was fond of, had a problem with a car and went to Narong about it, and Narong sorted it, and nobody mentioned it to me at all, which was in every practical sense the correct decision, and which landed on me like a dropped slab. I'd stopped being the man who makes payroll, and it turned out that when you subtract that from me, there isn't a great deal left, which is not their fault and was never their responsibility to fix. Pooky and I lasted another 9 months. I'm not going to perform the end of that marriage for content. It wasn't a betrayal, and it wasn't a blow-up. 2 people who had both organized their entire selves around provision found out what the other one looked like, with the provision removed, and neither of us liked it much, and we were honest enough by then to say so. We divorced by mutual consent at the Amphor in September 2024. Same building we'd married in. Took about 40 minutes, and there was no lawyer and no dispute because there was nothing to dispute, since everything was already in her family's name and always had been, legally and openly, with my knowledge, on advice, correctly. She said something to me outside on the step, and it's the last thing she ever said to me. She said, I never lied to you, Stewart. She didn't. Not once. Not about anything. And I've had 2 years to find one, and there isn't one. I did go and see a lawyer. Of course I did. Chiang Mai, October 2024. A Thai firm with an Australian qualified consultant, 4,000 baht for 90 minutes, and I went in with a folder of every transfer. He was very good, and he was finished with me in about 20 minutes. He asked whether any of it had been documented as a loan. Not 1 baht. He asked whether there was a written agreement anywhere, in any language, describing any of it as repayable. There was not. He asked whether I'd taken a registered interest over the land or the house, a usufruct, a superficies, a mortgage in my own favor, anything at all, recorded against the title. No, nothing. Never occurred to me, and I want to be honest, that if it had occurred to me, I'd have rejected it, because the whole point of what I was doing was that it wasn't a transaction. He said, quite gently, that everything I'd described was a gift, completed on transfer, and that Thai law treats a completed gift as final, except in a very narrow set of circumstances that plainly did not apply. He said a man who funds his mother-in-law's house and his nephew's degree and then wants it back 2 years later is not a creditor, he's a donor with regret, and there is no court anywhere that fixes that. Then he said, the sentence I paid 4,000 baht for, and would pay 10 times that for now. He said, Mr. Stewart, you have not been defrauded. You have been extremely generous without a plan. And those 2 things feel identical from the inside and are completely different in law. I walked out and sat in a coffee shop on Nimmenhamen for 2 hours and did not order anything. And the girl who worked there kept looking at me, and eventually I bought a bottle of water so she'd stop worrying. Here's the accounting, because I'm still a builder, and we finish with the numbers. 837,000 Australian dollars to the family over 40 months. Sin Sod and the wedding, about 80. The house, 126. Narong's pickup and gear, 40. Sutita's shop, 72. The land, 189. T's degree, 128. The funeral, 13. The monthly, 81. Medical for Yupin over 3 years, about 17. Cars, repairs, school fees, 3 motorbikes, a wheelchair ramp, and about 40 smaller things I can't itemize, and which come to something like 111. Plus the 400,000 baht I spent renovating a rental house, because I couldn't help myself. I had 1.1 million. I have 248,000, my super. And I turned 67 in Australia, which means the age pension is there if I need it. And I'm not too proud for it. I'm from Figtree. My mother would have taken it and been grateful. I live in a 2-bedroom unit in Ballina, 600 meters from the water, which I own outright. I do 2 days a week for a builder in Lennox Head, who needed someone who can read a set of plans and talk to a certifier without starting a war. He pays me and I don't need it, and I take it anyway, because a man should be paid. My daughters were angry for about a year. They're not now. My eldest asked me in March whether I'd have done it differently, and I told her the truth, which is that I'd have done about 600,000 of it exactly the same, and the other 237 I'd have put in an envelope and set fire to for the same result. Now, the useful part, because I've got nothing else to give you. Do not organize this as a series of decisions. That is the entire mistake, and everything else follows from it. If every request arrives on its own and gets judged on its own, you will say yes to all of them, because a request from a real person with a real problem always deserves a yes on its own merits. That's not weakness. That's arithmetic. 100 good yeses is still a broke man. So decide the number first, before anybody asks you for anything, and write it down. 1 figure, per year, for family support, all of it, everything, gifts and emergencies and business and school, and everything else in 1 bucket. Tell your partner what it is at the start of the year. Tell them again when it's half gone. And when it's gone, and the refusal isn't a judgment on the person in front of you, it's the calendar. That's the whole trick. You let the number do the refusing so you don't have to. Because you can't. I couldn't. I know exactly what I am now, and I could not do it. Write down what happens to the money if it stops. Who's relying on it, what they do when it ends, and how much notice they get. I gave the uncle 4 seconds notice at a kitchen table, and that was cruel. And it was cruel because I hadn't done the thinking, not because I said no. And ask the question I never asked, once, out loud, early, without heat. What does your family expect from this? Not accusingly, just as a thing 2 adults ought to be able to say to each other. Because there was a page in a notebook with my name at the top of it in November 2021, and there is a version of my life where I saw that page in December 2021 and said, righto, let's talk about it, and I'd still be married and there'd be 600 grand in the account and T would still be at Armit. That page wasn't the crime. Me never asking was the failure. Last thing, people want me to say she ruined me. She didn't. I'd have done the same thing in Australia. I very nearly did in 2003, and Robin had to put a ledger in front of me then too. This wasn't Thailand, and it wasn't Pooky. It was a bloke who was 9 years old at a bench in Figtree, watching his mother count coins, running the same program for 59 years, and finally running it somewhere with no brakes on it. I'm 68. I've got a unit, a pension, 2 daughters, and 2 days a week on the tools. There's a structural engineer graduating in Melbourne this year who wouldn't be there without me, and a house in May Rim with a concrete frame and proper footings that'll still be standing when everyone in this story is dead, and I put a ramp in it so a woman with bad eyes wouldn't fall. You can call that a disaster if you want. I've heard it. I made payroll. That's what I did with my life, and it turns out I did it right to the end, and I'd rather be the bloke who spent it than the bloke who died with it. I just should have written the number down.